Okay, welcome to Upside. I'm Dan Bowyer, and with Mads Jensen, we're both VCs at Superseed, where we back early stage technical founders transforming how the world works.
Yeah, we meet every week to unpack what's happening at the intersection of tech, venture, and business in Europe. So whether you're a founder or investor or really just curious about the forces driving our future, you're in the right place. Just remember, this is not investment advice.
And this week, we are looking at 2025. We've got two super chaps with us. We've got Andrew from 7% and Lomax from Outsized. And between us, we're going to crystal ball. We're going to have a look and have a ponder. Hopefully some of the things that aren't so popular, a bit more controversial perhaps, and have a look behind the scenes at what is going on in venture startup with a focus on Europe. And to start with, we're going to start with one of mine, which is I reckon Apple is going to win AI on the consumer side. I reckon they're the dark horse. And the reason that I say that, just to unpack this a little bit, is that they've been at AI for a while. I remember talking to a friend who works at Apple back in 2016-17, and they were, obviously this is pre-ChatGPT, and they were very, very mindful of what was going on. And they're always so good at being the last to market with these things. And because they have such an incredible ecosystem, and they own that ecosystem, and it's not fragmented like Android, and it's so interconnected with across your Macs, across your iPads, and across your iPhone. I think with such a loyal fan base, with so much money, so much resource, they brought over the head of Google last year to run the AI department. 87% of US teens own an iPhone. I think they might well crack it. Now, Mads, you're not a massive Apple fanboy. What do you reckon?
No, I don't mind. I just think it's a while since they've been really innovative. And I think your argument is, look, there's not really innovation that's needed here. It's execution. We got all the component parts. They can stitch together stuff from elsewhere and then integrate it beautifully. Yes, they often do. I saw, just as a side gig, I saw their Vision Pro now. They're discontinuing production.
Yes.
It's quite quick. So
that was always on the writing was on the wall, or the eyeballs were on the wall.
Yeah, I just think it's symptomatic of a company that's lost its way a little bit in terms of they used to be innovative, and it seems like they've lost some of that. And I think your argument
were they
maybe
innovative?
here is, I think Jobsy was innovating in the way he looked at the world.
Oh.
I think so. But I mean, you could argue there's no innovation. Everything is just stitching together different things, old things in new ways.
I don't know. I mean, I'd say Apple was a hugely innovative company, but I just want to ask, maybe, what are we talking about here, Dan? Is that what do we mean by, wins consumer AI? I'd love to actually unpack that a bit, because when I thought about it, when I think about it, I'm like, is this a winner takes all? What are we actually talking about? I mean, this device will probably sort of remain this device, and the installed base of it will continue to grow, I'm sure. But what do we mean by winning consumer AI?
For many people, I think Siri and voice will become useful. And the back thinking was around, because they own the ecosystem, if they get this right, which I think they have a fighting chance of doing with all the resource and with their partnership with OpenAI, if you can use voice to command apps on your phone to interact with other apps, because they control the entire ecosystem, Apple. So my thinking is that it will become almost like ChatGPT has become the kind of the known consumer standard. I think Siri will become the known consumer standard for AI in the consumer world. That's what I meant by Apple will win consumer AI. So I think that they will own Apple Intelligence, which I hated the name of when I first saw it. And I think they will end up owning it. And I think they will end up, I hope, and I think Siri will be useful. Mads always shouts at me for having wishful thinking. But I think there are enough data points here. There's enough infrastructural data points here where I think they can, if they get this right, let everyone else fight on the foundational side. I mean, we'll talk about, will OpenAI take it to the finish line? We'll talk about that later. But I think on the consumer side, I think Apple could become the de facto standard for how consumers interact with AI just by using voice.
One thing I will say is I think it's a really good point, is that the modality is, I think, going to change. So, we've been focused last year on text. I think voice will be the modality that everyone focuses on and will become the use case, the most prevalent use case. I also think, I know we talked about Vision Pro being discontinued, and there's actually a chance that Oculus might get discontinued, but I still think we're moving to a different form factor of device, and voice is going to be so important for mixed reality. So actually, I think the trend is in that direction. And so maybe you're right, Dan, in that case.
I thought the question of, is Apple an innovative company, was a really interesting one, because what is innovation? I don't think innovation is the same as invention. I mean, Apple did not invent the first MP3 player. There were a bunch of MP3 players before the iPod came along. Yeah,
Germans
if you
did,
ask,
no? Yeah.
well, I mean, if you ask the average person who invented the portable music player, they probably will say, "Oh, Apple, it was the iPod," because that's the one we remember. So for me, innovation's a collision of the right timing with a product which is sufficiently better that it grabs the imagination, and that feels like innovation. So I think it's too early with Apple, and sorry, with AI to say who's going to win. Because Dan, what I'm hearing from you, Dan, is that basically Apple will win because they've got access to the customer and they own the customer. Yet iPhone sales are flattening. And to your point, Mads, about the company in general. I mean, the Apple car's nowhere to be seen. The Vision Pro definitely didn't take off. Yes, they've got a market cap of like, what is it, 4 trillion. So they're not going anywhere. But I think the Vision Pro really suffered from a lack of killer app. And I think the last stat I saw was like it got like 3% market share in VR. So they've definitely failed last year to come out with anything which could be called a win in the market. Perhaps that's a case of the company trying to do too much, and they need to start to decide like what's really important. Are they going to try and win AI? Are they going to try and defend their iPhone market share? Is there still a car being built somewhere we don't know about? I don't think they're going anywhere because there's so much intelligence inside that company, right? There's such smart people work there. It's way, way too early to say that Apple or OpenAI will win the AI race.
I'm talking consumer here. I'm not talking business. I'm talking consumer.
But that differential becomes less and less significant, right? The sort of socialization of enterprise software, even the way now you capture enterprise users. If you think about Slack and other people, where you go bottom up, you capture the individual, which is essentially a D2C sale, and then you go upwards into the enterprise. So I'm not sure whether that differentiation even makes much sense anymore.
I think with Apple it might do. I don't think Apple is ever going to play that game. Okay, so next up we've got OpenAI will be dethroned as the AI leader. Mads, I think this is one of yours. Do you want to tee it up?
Look, they clearly came first out of the gate 2 years ago, launching ChatGPT, and I think they've had a phenomenal run and built up a really, really impressive business, sporting billions in annualized revenue now, growing very fast, and having the vast majority of the consumer market, back to consumers you were talking about before on the Apple piece. I mean, it's squarely in OpenAI's and ChatGPT's hands right now. What we saw last year was Google having a bit of a false start. In January, they came out with a Gemini that was so riddled with bugs that it was unusable. But they've really doubled down on AI now. They've got the whole founding team back in the lab. They've got the whole company oriented towards getting back to that leadership position in AI. And their models are really impressive. Gemini 2.0 is really impressive. You got Elon Musk out executing over at XAI. I think what he's done with Colossus is really, really impressive. You've got Anthropic building some super, super just wonderful models. I think if you look even today, and whether it comes to coding or whether it comes to prose and writing, the Claude model definitely beats the OpenAI models. Maybe in everything except for reasoning, where I think it's probably Google and OpenAI head to head today. But it just looks like OpenAI is being assailed from so many sides. And I think also given the turmoil they've had in the company, it's going to be hard for them to sustain the leadership they build up. So I'm expecting that they will be, if not dethroned, then certainly assailed from many angles. One aspect here that's really interesting is what we saw here just at Christmas time, which was the launch of DeepSeek 3, which is this Chinese open source model that was released to the world. And effectively, it's a model that's been built on a fraction of the training cost of the big Western LLMs. So whether it's Llama or GPT or Claude or Gemini, it's interesting that the Chinese team was able to build an open source model so inexpensively because it kind of changes the paradigm a little bit. And I don't think everybody's really figured out exactly what the implications are yet, whether we can borrow some of the innovation there. But what it certainly does suggest is this attempt there's been to hold China back in the AI race by restricting the export of chips has to some extent failed because they just found ways to out-innovate and create an amazing model even without that silicon. So super, super interesting angle to the development here.
Before I open up to the floor, what does dethroned mean to you?
Well, so today, OpenAI has got the leading share in market, and they've had the best models. And I think those are the two vectors, right? You can have the best technology, and you can have the most share. And I think certainly when it comes to models, I think they're going to be under attack, and I think they're going to be relegated to second place or third place. And market share, if not a catch up, then there will be others eating into their share. I think Anthropic already is doing extremely well when you look at AIs or in API workloads.
I also wonder where we're at on kind of peak LLM. But Andrew, what do you reckon? My sense is you'll agree with this.
Yeah, I don't know if it will be this year, but I think them winning is unlikely. There's a few reasons for that. First of all, I think you bet against Elon at your peril. And I'd probably bet against Elon part-time versus Sam full-time. And I don't know Sam, but just outside looking in, I think any company that has that sort of leadership turmoil, when you're dealing in this amount of money and this sort of pace of change, you've got to question whether it can go the distance. Because there's sort of three fights going on here. One is it's a fundraising war. At the moment, in order to pursue the path that those Western LLMs are taking, you need vast amounts of money. So who can raise the most money? Secondly, it's a technology and talent war. So, we've seen Marathi left, John Shulman went to Anthropic, right? One of the early OpenAI guys. So there are sort of people leaving a company. That's never a good sign for OpenAI either. So the smartest people inventing the smartest technology, because this technology is super early still, right? I don't believe you're going to get AGI from the current transformer model stack. So I almost feel like we're in an interim phase technology-wise. It's very early doors with this next gen of AI, and that could at any point be usurped by the next great thing that comes out. And the third part of that is there could be a enabling technology that comes out at any moment, which means that suddenly training is 1,000th of the cost it is today. So that could be one of the new chip technologies, reversible computing, or one of the other low energy silicon tech coming out. So I think it's just so early in the growth of both, not just the technology, but the whole industry itself, and it could go anyway. So I think OpenAI, in summary, is sitting on too much cash that it will be automatically dethroned in this year, in 2025. But in the next few years, I think we'll just see some real left of field entrance to the market, or different approaches or step changes in technology, either enabled by new silicon or just new AI models, but also because at the moment the current funding is we're in a completely new paradigm for valuations of companies so early and the amount of money they need. If you look back at other companies in the past, very few of them have approached these valuations at all. I mean, even now you're talking about you've got like SpaceX. I think SpaceX is now valued at north of 350 billion. You've got like Palantir IPO'd at 20 billion. ByteDance, which is the backer of TikTok, I think it's a few hundred billion. You've got Stripe at 100 billion. So the numbers we're talking about, and therefore the even the model for investment returns that OpenAI and XAI and others are going to have to deliver on, it's just completely new territory. We've not been here before. So I think from an investment point of view, there's a question mark about how long people are going to carry on throwing, 7 billion at it just for training and inference, which is what it's cost OpenAI.
But at least they're making revenue. A lot of the bubbles, there was not as much revenue. At least some of these big foundational companies.
But the multiples are incredibly high. And you're looking at a public sector multiple environment that's like as peak as it ever has been, right? Especially in tech. So
does anyone know what the unit economics are on actually serving a query from OpenAI?
It's £1 million a day to run, $1 million a day to run.
Yeah, Microsoft's saying they're pretty good, in excess of 50%.
Gross margin. Okay.
So Lomax, the dethrone, not dethrone.
I mean, I don't have a lot to add to what William said, other than I'd say is like, for the moment, the market is growing at such a rate that actually fighting over your market share is probably less relevant. It's great to have the, ego trip or the halo effect of being number one. But again, I don't think this is necessarily winner takes all. For the moment, at least, we're talking about the next 12 months. There's enough for everyone to fight over that. Yeah, it may lose its number one spot, but does that really matter for OpenAI at the moment? I think Andrew's got a good point. It's like, is OpenAI as an organization set up for success in the same way that its competitors are? And I think it sounds like probably not, which is more of a long-term kind of infrastructural problem that they have, I think.
But isn't there always conflict? Isn't there, especially with changing from this whole public serving to for profit? I mean, there's going to be conflict.
Well, there's always conflict for sure, right, in all of this. But B, actually, in a way, like the OpenAI model of moving from what it was to what it is, not many people have actually successfully done that.
They're not closing the not-for-profit side. They're not closing that.
That's the point they're making is if you look at all of the big companies that have been created the last 20, 30 years, like by and large, most of them are founder-led, right? Properly founder-led. And I'd argue that might not be the case for OpenAI.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair. I think it's fair. I want to stay with China. And Andrew, one of your points, this you put into the docket that this will be the year that decides what happens with China and what happens with going to war over Taiwan, or what happens with trade conflicts and other challenges between the East and West. What were you thinking here?
Yeah, I really just think a failure to defend Ukraine in the next 12 months is going to give a green light or not to countries with ideological goals, right?
And the assumption is that Trump won't back Ukraine. Is that the assumption?
I'm not going to assume anything about Trump. I think he's proven to be a hard to predict, which sometimes plays to benefit in foreign policy making. But I just think fundamentally, if we show weakness towards Russia, then that does indicate to other countries that we don't have the stomach for it. And that's how we've got to where we are today, by saying nothing about Crimea, gave him the confidence that we wouldn't care enough to do anything about Ukraine either. So that's absolutely critical, because China's watching and other countries are watching as well. North Korea is watching. So that has a knock-on effect to not just China, but I think also general geopolitical security. I mean, you've seen attacks there's a lot of asymmetric warfare going on, and a lot of it's been going on for a very long time, right? I mean, China attacks the UK infrastructure hundreds of thousands of times a day with hackers and AI bots, and tries to probe, tries to steal secrets, tries to shut things down.
Can you see any world where Taiwan has not been absorbed by China within a decade?
I think it comes down to whether America wants to maintain its authority in the world or not, because they've made it very clear they will defend Taiwan. Doesn't mean they will.
I thought it was always a point of strategic ambiguity. The Chinese government has just put in an order for 1 million attack drones. China's manufacturing capacity is just totally unrivaled. And these drones completely change the nature of warfare, and in some respects renders American naval supremacy irrelevant, because you can sink the carriers with all these attack drones. I mean,
but let's look at what that does longer term. So let's say that China in some way attacks Taiwan. America does not respond. What does that say to the rest of the world? Not just China, but every other country, but also China itself. If China decides, actually, well, that was quite easy, and they're expansionist, they're ideologically expansionist, the greater China. They don't want the power rival status quo that exists in the world today. So that message is that, well, do what you want, basically.
I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just asking whether you can see a scenario where it doesn't happen. I'm struggling to see the U.S.
really hope not.
facing.
I really hope not.
Oh, no, listen, I don't disagree with you, but I'm just struggling to see a scenario where the U.S. faced with China being as strong as it is today on the manufacturing base. So the West won the Second World War on the back of the American manufacturing base. Okay, that's been eroded. China is supremely number one today. I just don't see how the U.S. Maybe the U.S. could win, but you'd have to go to such an extent. The cost would be so high.
But it always
if you
is
go head-to-head with
in any great power conflict, and that's the biggest danger. That's why deterrence is so important. That's why spending the gold now rather than later, which will be gold and blood, is absolutely vital. I wouldn't underestimate the ability of America to step up and put all that industrial might into onto a war footing. And I still wouldn't bet against the United States. And also, warfare is not just about the ability to produce drones. You've then got the ability to run a military and run military operations. China is not anywhere near as experienced as, actually, ironically, the West in actually fighting wars. One of the reasons North Korea is putting men on the ground in Ukraine is so it gets some war fighting experience. It hasn't fought a war in 60, 70 years, right? Men haven't seen armed combat. So all the enormous infrastructure that backs up actually just being able to deploy a drone, from the avionics, from the integrated communications, all that stuff has to be exceptional to win. And I don't think actually China's at that point. There are areas where it's strong, but you're right that their advantage is overwhelming numbers.
There's also a question of proximity. I think if the argument is whether China will be able to invade and hold California or even Hawaii, I'd 100% agree with you. I just don't think the U.S. will want to go to the lengths you are describing, and the country would have to do, to hold and defend Taiwan against China. I don't see it happening. And I think the determination on Xi's part to absorb Taiwan eclipses everything else. And to see the Chinese economy is really not doing great, and his population is starting to suffer. I mean, there are many, many warning signs. The bond yields have fallen off a cliff. You're really, the domestic economy is struggling in many ways. But I think he's so determined to do this. And I think at the end of the day, power accrues to those who want it the most. I think Xi wants Taiwan to come, be reunified with or be absorbed by China. I think vastly eclipses the U.S.'s desire to defend Taiwan. And therefore, I think it will happen. I think that's my forecast. But I agree with everything you're saying. I don't disagree with any of it. I just don't think the U.S. is going to step up in the way that would be required.
Well, two quick things. One is that Trump doesn't want to be world police. I think that's I don't think he'll turncoat on that. And
I think Trump says that, by the way, but I actually think he won't necessarily act in that way. But yeah, okay.
Well, I think I'm not convinced that he wants to be, world police. And also, secondly, once the chip manufacturing really comes online in the States, what would be the commercial need to protect Taiwan? We've already seen the TSMC plant in Arizona, now producing the highest quality chips. So America has got the production capacity. So what would be the strategic need to stop China from? But as we've seen with their models, maybe they don't need them. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we'll never
because
really
I
know.
think this will come down to how does the US, and without in a way a little bit out of our lane in a sense, but this impacts so importantly so much on what we do as a day job that you can't ignore it. Is that if you a bit like Putin in the Crimea, if you hand Taiwan on a plate to Xi, then you're basically handing the whole of Southeast Asia to him on a plate. They're already saber-rattling with the Philippines, with Vietnam, etc. I think it's a message. If the US does nothing in respect of Taiwan, I think that sends the message that the rest of Southeast Asia is open for it.
Are you talking about what you think should happen or what you think will happen?
I think that's what happens if the US decides to not do anything about Taiwan.
So should you think the US would put American Marines on the ground in Taiwan to defend Taiwan against Chinese aggression?
It's a very good question.
Depends how the conflict starts. So, to manage your question around why would the US or whether the US would defend against Taiwan? I mean, it's not just about the fabrication plant. I think Dan has a really good point that decreases the most obvious reasons from a protection technology point of view. But you've also got to think about trade routes, freedom of navigation with the Strait of Taiwan, one of the busiest maritime routes. That would put China control of that. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, all of them would be terrified at the prospect of China having taken over Taiwan and unopposed, because as an expansionist power, they're some of the obvious next in line targets, right? So one would really hope that we've learned our lesson by now, that you don't let a capable, large, powerful country evade unopposed, as a first step of its expansionist policy. And the problem with both Russia and China is that they are an expansionist country, but they're also insecure countries. So on the one hand, you want to show enough deterrence that you demonstrate the will and capacity to perhaps make them think twice about invading A, Ukraine, or B, Taiwan. But on the flip side, because they're both insecure psychologically as well, in that China thinks everyone's out to get it, and Putin certainly does, and we showed some signs of that, unintentionally or not, with NATO. If you show too much strength, then actually that makes them more paranoid, and then they do something like invade Ukraine anyway. So they're very difficult states from a statecraft point of view to actually manage.
There was an interesting point you raised, Matt, when you asked me, is would US put Marines on the ground? I think we need to start thinking about warfare in a different way. The US can deliver comprehensive, very impactful support to Taiwan without putting boots on the ground, particularly with modern weapons. And this actually takes me to a point I was thinking about over the Christmas break, which was there is an element of the world that feels very like 1914 at the moment, with all of the different kind of insecurities that we have everywhere. But it also feels like a little bit like 1914 in a technological standpoint, which is very interesting. It's particularly ties into defense tech and what we're seeing, which is that in 1914, you only just had the first of the industrial wars happen. You had a little bit of the industrialization of warfare in the US Civil War. Then you had the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Civil War. 1914 was when really the impact of the industrialization had a massive impact on the way we fought wars. You still had the French charging in 1914, still charging on horses into battle, right? And I feel like we are analogously at that kind of point in time now with warfare, right? Where everything is becoming more automated, more drones, automated ships, etc. So I think that's a very interesting inflection, and then ties into kind of, I think, where our world of investing in defense. But I think that maybe answers your question, Mads, is that there's a lot the US can do without putting boots on the ground to deter China.
Where else did you want to go, Lomax, with your defense tech surge? Because that was one of your points.
Well, I think
there's going to be
in predictions,
a big 2025 push.
Yeah, we've seen the first cohort and wave of new wannabe defense primes come through, like Anduril in the US and Helsing in Europe. And you now have Saronic that raised a massive Series C, I think, last year in the US on the naval side. We've seen that first wave. I think that will continue. And I think we'll have more maybe vertical specific, problem specific companies coming up, raising money. If you look 10, 15 years ago, none of these countries, apart from the US, were really Western countries were investing in defense. The percentage of GDP was tiny. They'd all whittled away their defense budgets to nearly nothing. Now they decided to up this, and they're now meeting their 2% NATO threshold. And, countries like Poland are going way in above that, right? Those decisions will kind of stay in place. That's policy now for the next 5-10 years, I think.
Yeah.
No one's going to touch it, which means that, our people that we're backing and working with, who are starting companies now, have a kind of long runway to build companies and actually have a kind of winning and cashed up client base to fund the innovation that will be needed in the private sector. So I think I'm bullish on the sector, as it were, despite the difficulties of public sector procurement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Just a quick question. Do you think the VC model is appropriate for defense tech companies, though? Because there have been so few trade sales or IPOs, and a lot of these companies are not, there's only going to be one or two new primes, right? And therefore, how do you get the returns with the traditional VC model for companies that produce something that might be really important, but is either a subsystem of a larger system that, a prime produces, or is, a small piece of tech that, the troops on the ground want, but isn't going to give you a multi-billion-dollar outcome?
It's a great point, and not to patronize you, because this better than me, but let's not be backwards looking at a forwards looking industry, right? So let's be okay, yeah, you're right. It is not necessarily traditional. We're not going to have tons of vertical SaaS companies, right? In this field, there's a couple of nice things I'd say. One is there's tons of, because a lot of these companies are building hardware, difficult things. There's tons of non-dilutive funding, big 100 million government contracts, right, available, which mean actually the dilution that you might be worried about, that problem might not be as bad as people might think. But to answer your question, I think you're right. I think that is, and we think about this when we look at sort of pre-seed and seed stage defense companies. I suggest there will be consolidation. There will only be this will be a little bit more winner takes all, unlike what we talked about earlier. But you know what? I don't know about you guys. I've done this tons of times where companies were very vertical specific. They've actually consolidated and teamed up with another team, and you combine, you receive shares in what will end up becoming the winning company. I still think you can make your 50, 100x returns like that, So I still think that the consolidation, as long as you're not overpaying for the shares that you're receiving in these deals. So in a way, as long as the company is performing such that they have bargaining power when they do a share for share exchange and actually consolidate, I still think, you end up with the potential for a decent ownership of that new prime.
There's also the dual use aspect. I mean, it's going to be such a tech push. Then, as you already alluded to, Lomax, that the next warfare that we see will be very, very technically driven, and a lot of the stuff that we do is already dual use. But Mads, have you got any thoughts on the defense piece?
You both have really good points. I think you are looking at a sector which will see massive secular growth just by virtue of the fact that defense spending as a percentage of GDP has been very low, between 1% and 2%, and it's going to increase to between 2 and 3 and 3 and 4. So you're going to see at least a doubling of the market size here over the next few years. And that's billions of dollars that will flow into some new tech areas. I mean, if you just go to the traditional existing defense primes and nowhere else, you're not going to see the innovation we need. So I think my concern about it is it will be politically driven. And we know that politicians don't always make the best decisions when it comes to sort of being forward looking and thinking about things in a tech orientated way. But if things are done right, there'll be a great opportunity here. And, I think, Andrew, that's your point. It's the risk of the segment of the ecosystem.
It's also important to remember that the defense is not just bullets and bombs and, attack drones. It's resilience of critical infrastructure, it's
all the cyber stuff,
cyber security, it's offensive AI,
energy,
and that's a far bigger sector than just the kinetic weapons that you'd automatically think about.
It feels like the whole defense push will also push up the agenda, manufacturing, supply, that whole protectionism, nationalism, modern language set will create more opportunities for countries and therefore startups to support their.
I think it's worth saying that the UK and Europe are grossly behind, particularly Europe. I mean, there's a fundamental ideological change that needs to happen. At the moment, a lot of VCs can't invest because their LPs, the EIF, still have mandates within their legals, which means they can't invest anything that even slightly smells like, something military or something even to do with defense. That's a big problem. That needs changing before a lot of VC firms can invest in a lot of these companies in Europe. You've then got a institutionalized dislike of hardware. Everybody, I was in Vienna at an event, a really, really great day that Speed Invest ran, a room full of 30 GPs, pretty much all of them bar two won't touch hardware. Oh, hardware takes far too much capital. Oh, hardware is really difficult. They're just Europe's just so behind mentally.
Well, that's a quotient of fund size, isn't it? Isn't that a factor of fund size?
No, because actually the idea that today hardware automatically takes more money is not necessarily true. A, because of what Lomax said, which is that there's lots of grants out there for some of the deep companies you can actually get large contracts. But secondly, to win with a SaaS product now is incredibly expensive because it's so noisy. The barriers to entry are so low that you have to spend all that money that you might spend on hardware development, you spend on marketing to actually be seen and to then own the market and beat your competitors. So when you look at the data, it's actually not necessarily that more expensive. The difference is where the revenue comes. The revenue may come later. So it requires an appetite for risk, which again, UK and Europe, we're behind on the US, where you need to spend the money up front to get the product into market because it takes more money to get the product to the market. But to actually win, arguably, it could take the same amount of money.
I'll give you, we've got 60 companies across our different funds. The 3 best performing companies, all hardware companies, all of them, without question.
Is that med? What kind of hardware?
1 space and 2 dual use.
Well, they're in the right place. Andrew, I want to stay with you. So one of your predictions for this year was this choice around sovereign control, the EU and the UK. Where were you going with this?
So I think because of the rapid progression of technologies and how important some of these technologies are versus the last 15 years of TikTok and your email and other stuff, which isn't as fundamental. There's a timeline where we can catch up and a timeline where we'll be left behind. And I say we, I mean like the UK and Europe. And I think the 3 technologies are AI, quantum computing, and access to space. And very briefly, like AI, you've got to think about AI like an independent nuclear deterrent, right? Not just general artificial intelligence in future, but if your entire economy is propped up on AI, from the point of view of a country, then that's the equivalent really to someone else owning your mobile network of your country, being controlled by the US or the internet itself. The difference is the internet, the US can't turn off the internet, right? You could try and attack like the 13 root servers and attack the IXPs and the DNS infrastructure and everything else, but it was designed not to be turned off, right? So even if the US tried to turn off the internet, they'd really struggle. These walled garden AIs controlled by US national companies, they can be turned off, or they can just decide, actually, hey, we're not going to let the UK use this anymore. And you say, well, why would they ever do that? But that's quite a big risk to take if your entire economy in 5 years' time, everything you do is connected in some way to an AI owned by somebody else. The quantum computing, I think companies that have access to quantum utility, which is the ability not just to like crack encryption, but the processing power to sort of create new materials, accurately predict the weather, predict the economy, create new drugs, or even like weapons. These countries will have a fundamental advantage over those that don't have that technology. And again, is that something that the US or another country is just going to happily let us use, and at what cost and with what restrictions? And then lastly, access to space. If you control space, then you have control of planet Earth, which if you just pause and think about it for a second, is pretty sobering. And currently, the European and the UK have access to we have one launch site, which is in control of the French, part of ESA in West Guyana. I think the US have like 20 vertical launch sites in the US alone, just on the US mainland.
So the main context for you for space is defense, is security, national security. Is that the main?
Ultimately, without that, all bets are off, right? There is no satellite TV. There is nothing else, right? If you're existentially exposed to someone shutting down everything in your country because they can either fire weapons from space at you or they can shut down your satellites, what are you going to do? You go dark, right? Your country goes dark.
Lomax, do you invest in space?
We invest in space, yes.
What's your
With
take
Andrew,
on
actually.
Do you? Mads and I were talking about the reasons and the commercial model around space, and when the whole push happened several years ago, it kind of dawned on me, oh, this is mining rights. This is all about, finding asteroids full of whatever, rare earths, diamonds, platinum, whatever it might be. But what are the contextual drivers, or what are the guiding lights to invest in space?
Well, I think like one of the biggest things to think about is that I think now we have, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 10,000 satellites in orbit. By 2028, 2030, we'll have 10,000. Sorry, 100,000. So the use of lower Earth orbit in particular, for things that such as Andrew just said, weather prediction, communication, like vital things for countries, is proliferating, right? And then you have a whole economy that feeds off that. So you have 100,000 satellites in space, it gets crowded. Space debris becomes a problem. Therefore, you have a bunch of startups targeting space debris as a problem, like moving bits of debris, deorbiting satellites, etc. That's a very one narrow vertical, but that's an example of, we are using space for more and more. Mining, I think, I think there's activity and investment going on to mining, but I would say, I don't know about you, Andrew, but mining is like a very, 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 very small component of what is really, really going on in the context of space. And so, using low Earth orbit for things that we do on Earth is actually the biggest use case at the moment. Then there's deep space exploration for things like mining, colonizing Mars, etc. But I think and there is investment there, and we look at companies that are targeting that. But there's actually a bigger prize to be had in a shorter term, kind of next 10-year time frame.
In communications and information, that's the main. So is it a 2025 prediction that there'll be more investment in space based on getting 100,000 satellites into orbit? Is that the prediction?
If we are going to use space more and more and more for what we do on Earth, you're going to need a whole infrastructure around that to deliver that, right? To bring, Elon Musk previously talked about bringing down the cost of delivering a kilogram into space. So the cost of launch comes down using reusable rockets, et cetera, which means you can then send more things into space, use it more. Another example is like space manufacturing. It's possible to design and manufacture products in a zero gravity environment, right? Which you can't do on Earth. So for example, you can actually manufacture some drugs in space that you can't do in the UK, right? Because of the impact that gravity has on the biology. So you have use cases like that. But what does that require? That requires you need to send your materials up to space and get them back in an affordable way. It enables the actual satellites to be built for purposes such as that. That is where investment is going into. But I think the use case is that on Earth for humanity.
There'll be things like you're saying that we don't quite know until we do it. But that feels a bit flimsy to me.
I was going to say, I think the space economy will be huge, but there's stacked risks at the moment. And that stacked risk is really the cost of getting into orbit. I mean, I think Falcon 9 is about $3,000 per kilogram. Falcon Heavy costs about $11,000 per kilogram, I think. And the promise of Starship is that it'll come down to like $200-300 per kilogram. And once you're down at that sort of cost, then, all the people who want to put stuff into orbit and all the ideas we don't have yet that are possible, I think we'll really see the use of space version in lots of interesting ways. But as an investor today, to Lomax's point, we really have to think carefully about our timelines for returns. We've got to return things we invested today. We've got to make a return in 7 to 10 years. So we've been focused at 7% very much on the picks and shovels where there's an existing market. So whether that's something like Interstellar Labs, where they're producing biospheres for growing plants and food in space, but can be used on Earth today in inhospitable environments, or for specialist plant production for perfumeries and that sort of stuff, all the way through to like MagDrive, which we co-invested
super
with
niche,
outside.
that one.
Well, you think, but actually there's a huge number of uses for specialized greenhouses and hydroponics where you can reliably grow a plant and that's controlled and reliably get an output for trying to grow something, right? And of course, the long-term vision is that, Elon may get you to Mars, but then what are you going to eat when you get there, right? SpaceX can't do everything. And so even on the moon, you've got people talking about building moon bases. You've got people talking. There are multiple startups building space stations. All these people are going to have to eat something, right? So,
do you
and then
think
you've got
we'll be an
things like-
interplanetary species?
Will we? Yeah, 100%. And you've got companies like MagDrive where are like plasma thrusters, and there are thousands of satellites being built, and these are 10x better thrusters for satellites. So we focused on investing where there is a market today, but there's a long-term vision.
Maybe you can summarize it like this, that there are things that you can do, you can use space for that you can't do on Earth, right? And so communications, intelligence, defense, particularly, and then use cases like manufacturing, the kind of example I gave, right? That has been constrained by the cost of launch, right? Presume, like in the past, only the Russians and NASA had a monopoly on this, right? SpaceX or duopoly. SpaceX came in, by investing tons of private sector money and government money, they brought down the cost of launch to enable people to use and access more and more space. So that as that happens, the people will be able to, in a way that makes sense from a unit economics perspective, actually use space for the things that it can be useful for in a cost-effective way that makes sense for a private enterprise. Not just SpaceX, though. There are tons of companies like Andrew alluded to that are effectively picks and tools companies, right? So obviously launch companies, propulsion companies, reorbiting is a whole, deorbiting, reorbiting, like all of this is like new foundational enabling technologies where we have invested and where, tons of other, private sector money has gone into. And I think that is only going to continue. As I said, the prediction of,
they've got to survive though, right? Like, you've got to have enough satellites that need deorbiting or moving or servicing. And the challenge today, I think, of some of those companies is that until this cost of launch comes down, is your customer base large enough for you to survive to actually deliver a service to someone who's going to pay? And I think that's, we see a ton of really exciting stuff, as I know we all do in space tech, but it's like, well, can't invest in that because the market's not big enough. It's the classic, is the market big enough?
Well, you're investing in tomorrow's market, though, aren't you? I mean, you're investing in, 3-5 years market. You're not investing in
but
today's
when
market.
is Starship going to be launching daily? Like, is that next year? I don't think it's 2025. Might be 2026, maybe. Probably more like 2027, 2028.
Yeah, and as we know, like being 3 years early in our world can mean that you get recapped
timing,
halfway
baby.
through, right? So the company may
But
be
this
a
goes
good
right
bet
back
still.
to the root of timing's everything. 2, if not 3, of my companies failed because it was the right idea at the wrong time. So when you look at whether it's Apple Intelligence or OpenAI or any of these things, like timing is absolutely critical. When you think back to there were 5 major social networks before Facebook. Black Planet started in 1999. I started my first startup in 98. I did a location-based social network in 2001, 3 years before Facebook started. So that was stupid. And then, you look then even at Google. I mean, there were multiple search networks, search directories before Google. Google was like, what, the 30th, 40th?
Google was the 13th search engine. Yeah.
So it's entirely possible that actually step change technology comes along for AI on the chip side that makes this stuff just commoditized to be able to train AI models. New types of AI models and math is utilized for a new type of AI, and all the existing companies are just swept away.
Lomax, I think you're absolutely right. Your prediction is that the investment in enabling space technologies will continue. I have the corollary or the flip side of that prediction is I think there will definitely be a massive set of write-offs, exactly, Andrew, as you're pointing out. It's the same thing that happens with every new sector. And I think what you're saying here is space enables comms, defense, manufacturing. It enables intelligence. We've got some great intelligence startups, not just from a military and defense perspective, but also just kind of intelligence in terms of investment, in terms of raw materials, in terms of commodities. And then there's the future of logistics, as you're saying, and exploration and colonization. So you have all these use cases, so much excitement, so much capital flowing in. There will be a reckoning. There will not be enough revenue dollars quickly enough to justify, every investment dollar that's been invested, and there'll be some big write-offs. And then some of the technology will survive exactly as happened with the dot-com boom, and that will lay the ground for a future sector. And so I think long-term, very bullish. Short-term, I think there will be more capital flowing in. Mid-term, I'm sure there will be a reckoning, and there will be some disappointed people in the space place. That doesn't mean that folks won't be able to make money, but I think a lot will be disappointed here over the next 1 or 2 or 3 years.
Now, Mads, one of your predictions for 2025 is that we're going to get a recession in the US, and then obviously there will be impact globally. There will be impact in the EU and for the UK. What do you think is going to happen here?
I think it's really interesting. If you look back at the predictions for the stock market from the big banks for 2024, every single one of them were too conservative. Everybody was wrong. Everybody thought that the market would increase, but not nearly as much as it ended up doing. There's a lot of excitement now. US retail investors have never been as excited about the stock market in living memory as they are right now. And so everybody sort of feels like, what can go wrong? Trump is being elected. Everything is looking very rosy. Well, the truth is, if you look under the covers, that the Fed has been trying to get US interest rates down, and it's been lowering with about 100 basis points since September. But as the Fed funds rate has gone down, yields have gone up by 100 basis points, right? So yields have gone in the opposite direction from the guiding rates from the Fed, and they're now at about 4.6%. That's not great for the economy at all. Chicago PMIs, so the Purchasing Managers Index, the procurement offices that are trying to say how bullish are we about the future, is weak to the point where it's pointing to a recession. U.S. credit cards serious delinquency rates for subprime borrowers has hit a 22% rate. Okay, so 22% of subprime borrowers on credit cards are seriously delinquent. It's the highest rate since 2010.
And the amount of debt is I think it's 1.2 trillion on.
It's a massive 1.2 to 1.3 trillion. Yes, U.S. credit card providers wrote off $45 billion in 2024. It's the highest since 2010. You have on the commercial side, you have commercial office loans. Delinquency rates now are there at 11%, which is above the peak from 2012. And we'll recall that a couple of years ago we had the shock in the market with Silicon Valley Bank. Now, small banks like SVB control 2/3 of loans in the commercial real estate book. So it just kind of indicates that there could be a huge issue there for the smaller banks, which is such an important part of local economies in the US in 2025. And so all of these things, I think, mean that there will be some kind of recession late in the year. The stock market often front runs recessions. And I think what will happen is you're looking at the top 10 stocks are now 40% of the S&P 500. So it's the Max 7 plus Broadcom and Berkshire Hathaway and JP Morgan. And the top 3 stocks alone, they're 20%. So Apple, NVIDIA, and Microsoft. So think about this. You got an S&P 500. You have 500 stocks. Now, the 3 top stocks are 20%, and the other 497 are the other 80%. So it's just nuts how lopsided, how concentrated it is. And there are really, really good reasons for that. The free cash flow of the top 10 stocks is the largest in history. So we're looking at 27% free cash flow. It's never been higher, right? So the top companies are more profitable than we have ever seen in history. And that's why the stock index is so concentrated, because these big companies are just performing so extremely well. But it also makes the stock market extremely concentrated and very vulnerable to these few stocks. And what I think you'll see this year is you'll see misfires from a couple of the big companies, and that will trigger the rout because the market is so thin, the width of the rally is so thin. So I think you'll see a correction to stock markets in the early half of 25, and I think you'll see a smallish recession in the second half of 25.
Define recession. So that recession will be 3 consecutive months of negative growth.
Two quarters. 2 quarters.
2 quarters. Right. Okay. Lomax, what do you reckon?
Not many miles dissimilar. So I think it only takes NVIDIA to have an earnings miss to create panic in the market, given how flimsy things are. And we took, the retail investors will take fright, etc. So I don't think we're in for a stock market crash, but we're definitely in for a correction. One of those earnings misses is going to cause some panic. I think you're right. I mean, I don't disagree with you, Mads. I think it will be more a kind of technical recession. I think you might have the 2 quarters in a row of negative growth, but in a way we won't really feel that on the ground. And so I think it will be mild and technical at worst.
What's left of Europe and the UK will end up in a recession, the rate everybody's going, but the US matters more. I think trying to work out what's going to happen is almost a fool's errand, right? You can build a model to justify your economic predictions, as many erstwhile economists do, and make great money doing so. But bar having a black swan or a white rhino event like the sort of subprime or something similar, I don't think there's going to be a recession next year. When I was in the US in the fall, everybody I spoke to said, "Oh, 2025 is going to be great," and for lots of reasons. They all had different reasons why 2025 was going to be great, but fundamentally, the economy is a sentiment-driven machine, and I think if everybody wants the buyout market to come back and the IPOs to come back, then it will be self-realizing through that positive sentiment. And I think that combined with the sort of the optimism that people will choose to have in the business sector, at least because of Trump, if I was a betting guy, I'd say we won't have a recession and actually the economy will pick up.
Well, the economy has already been growing very strongly, right? The US economy grew 3%
Yeah,
in 24. And I just think you'll struggle to maintain that growth with the backdrop of what you're seeing around debt, both the fiscal position of the US government, which will have to be addressed, and also the private sector leverage.
Well, Doge is going to sort that, Mads, right? So Vivek and
unemployment
Elon
went down
are
the last quarter in the US as well. So, the signals are arguably good.
Doge is rubbish, but maybe that's another conversation. But guys, if we talk about Europe, let's talk.
That's a whole podcast by itself, Loman.
It is. I think it's. But think about Europe side, because I focused on the US. Germany and France, the two biggest economies in Europe, ex-UK, cannot get a budget approved at the moment because they're in political stasis, right? This is mental, right? You have the UK, which has approved a budget, but, in a way seems to be doing its best to potentially shoot itself in the foot from a growth perspective, even though the government's paying a lot of lip service to growth. So the three biggest economies in Europe, UK are politically not in a great position. And so I think, for what we talked about in the context of the US, as Andrew said, could be very, very different in Europe. It's going to be a slow year, I think, in this side of the pond. There'll still be great founders building. It's a great time to invest in startups, but, the kind of putting at the kind of macro level, not exciting at all.
It goes to the heart of the psychology of North America versus UK and Europe. In order to get us out of, slow growth, what is the Labour government doing? It is taxing more heavily. And it is, we need to spend less money and austerity. And the US is the opposite. It's throw money at the problem, speculate to accumulate, lower taxes. Government spends its way out of. It's fundamentally opposite. And guess who's doing better?
Yeah, and guys, one thing I think that is a big theme for 2025, right? Because once Trudeau goes in Canada, right, we're going to be it's the year of the kind of strong man, strong woman, right? I think once Trudeau's gone, which he will do, in the G7, the only kind of left of center government will be Keir Starmer, will be Labour, right? So Europe is moving in that direction as well. And will be interesting to see what that has. AFD could perform incredibly well in Germany. And it seems like with Elon Musk cashing up Nigel Farage, we could be in for, big changes in the UK in the next 4 or 5 years. So I think that is all very, very interesting, but very damaging at the same time, because it's not great for markets.
I'd like to pick up on Andrew's point. I think you're absolutely right, Andrew. And the US has been growing a lot faster than Europe. If we look at US R&D investment, it's nearly 2 times the investment in Europe, which is a function of 2 things. Spending per GDP or investment per GDP dollar is higher. So it's nearly 3.5% in the US versus 2.2% in Europe. And GDP is higher. So you have a higher GDP base and you're investing a bigger portion of GDP. And nearly 92%, according to recent research, nearly 92% of the US R&D is traced back to venture-backed companies. So if we want Europe to reboot and become a powerhouse of growth again, like it has been in the past, we have to get the venture industry working. And it means some of the work that we're doing in the foothills of backing very early stage founders and helping them, get off the blocks and build great companies. But it also means access to the scale up and the growth capital, both from a kind of the monetary side, but also in terms of the institutional knowledge, the cultural, the ecosystem to help build these bigger companies. Now, Dan, we had a discussion a couple of weeks ago about whether we should really look to build trillion-dollar companies in Europe. I think this comes back to we have to have the courage and ambition to go down this road and finding these winners and backing them and growing them and developing these global businesses of the future, because otherwise we won't get the R&D dollars and we won't create the economy we want to see to boost the growth.
And keeping them, of course.
Exactly.
Well, technology is the future of everything, right? And the political leadership just doesn't understand that.
My sense is they do. They just can't do anything about it.
I think that's an excuse. When you look at the Labour government who came in and said, we want to make, it's the same old rhetoric. We want to make UK, Silicon Valley of Europe, blah, 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 blah. We want to AI superpower, blah, 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 blah. And actually both colours of government, what did Rishi did? He decided he was going to hold a summit on AI safety. Well, that's about as far away from AI growth as you can get, right? And it's important. I'm not saying it's important, but if your goal is to catch up and win, that's not where you focus your efforts. Secondly, with the Labour government and Rachel Reeves' policies, on the one hand, they say, we recognise technology is going to be the growth driver of the UK and venture capital is really important and Mansion House Compact and everything else. And then what does she do? She increases taxes on, venture partner returns, within VC. The rhetoric is not aligned to the policy, because if you want growth, if you want to grow a bigger pie so that there is more tax, so that the government can put money to work for the people who need it most, then you have to focus all your policies around growth, and you align all your policies around growth. What you don't do is create a big debate in the industry which triggers multiple high net worths to leave the country, for GPs to decide to start their fund outside the UK. If someone's not going to start a fund in the US, surely you want them to look at Europe and go, I've got a choice of where I start my fund in Europe. Where should I go? Oh, I'll go to the UK. No, actually, I won't go there because it looks like actually they're going to tax GPs more than they will elsewhere. I mean, it's just basic. Money has a choice where to go. The rich people have the greatest choice where to go. They have flexible freedom, economic freedom to where they go and where they are taxed. And you just can't get away from that. But what happens is that they say one thing and then they make policy decisions driven ideologically. And that happens with the Conservatives as well, by the way. They make ideological decisions to privatize something, get a really shitty deal for that national, and just privatize it, even though, it's making a profit. It's making a profit, leave it alone. I think the electorate are just fed up with poor decision making. I don't think people care anymore whether something's nationalized or whether it's privatized. I think they just want the damn thing to work. And I think we need more decisions to be made in government based on data and based on non-ideological decision making. What is the best thing to create growth? Let's just create growth. And if that means, I don't know, nationalize the train industry, let's just nationalize the fucking train industry. I don't care. I just want results.
A motivated man. I want to talk very quickly before we round off, very quickly about M&A IPO. So Lomax, one of yours is that the IPO window is going to open up, and Mads, one of yours is that M&A activity is going to pick up. So Mads, should we start with you on the M&A side? This is quite counter. What's the deal here?
Well, yeah. So we talked about U.S. recession. I think if there is one, it will be shallow. What we've seen on the M&A side is there's been years of pent-up demand, and years of pent-up supply, to be fair. There's great companies that have grown to very meaningful sizes. And of course, there are lots of big corporates that are looking at the market and saying, look, there's some amazing targets out there, and have not been able to do deals because you've had a regime in the U.S. that was very anti-tech and very anti-big tech and M&A. Interest rates are higher than expected, but I don't think they're high enough to scupper the good deals. And I think, if you were to paint a positive case on the potential smaller recession, it is that it could potentially reset some investor expectations around valuations. And so I think that means that there'll be opportunities to exit some positions and create some liquidity back into the system, which is, frankly, what everybody wants and needs. So I think from that perspective, I'm quite optimistic on 25.
And Lomax, just to round off, IPOs, windows opening up. This is your point. So 2025 more IPOs?
For sure, there's tons of IPOs that have been shelved or delayed in the last 24 months that are now, waiting. Founders, investors, debt holders, etc., all waiting for this to open up. And I think there's a high chance it does in 2025. You've got big companies like Klarna, talking about European companies. In the US, you have Cerebras on the AI side. There's a bunch of companies that are stacked in line for IPOs. So I'm sure the bankers are licking their lips and, trying to get these companies into a position all prepped for a kind of Q2 listing. Once, I guess, the inauguration has happened, probably make sure that's been done seamlessly. I think on the M&A side, I agree with Mads. There's tons of cash on balance sheets, right? And actually, one final point is that, we've seen a lot of constraints on M&A within tech from the antitrust authorities in the last 2-3 years, right? And actually, that's been driven by a kind of zealous, FTC led by Lina Khan. And I think that will soften under Trump, such that, obviously we saw the obviously the Figma deal got shot down by the FTC, right? So I think there will be deals where that will happen less. So that plays into the M&A.
Before we go, what's your top focus for 25? What's on your mind? What's the one thing that springs to mind when I mention this coming year?
Yeah, I've given up on European risk capital. European risk capital at Series A, Series B, Series C in the private markets is dead. So I'm only interested. One thing I have not given up on European founders or European technology. So I know this has happened for years, but the only thing I've focused on in 2025 is pre-seed founders in Europe who are willing to take my check, get on a plane, go to the US. Yeah. We're not even going to build to Series A and then move. I want people who are willing to just take the check and run and go and weave US DNA into the company from the beginning. Because actually one thing I've learned, and you guys have seen this, is building a European company and then sort of naively thinking that you can take it to US for a Series A or with a little road show or a couple of road shows. It's very, very hard. So that's my obsession in 2025. Let's check in a year's time.
I can see the face. I can see this is going to happen. Mads, what's on your mind for 25?
Backing great founders that are building technology companies to reinvigorate Europe's industrial base. We've got to get manufacturing back. We've got to get our industry back. We've got to start making things again and become the best in the world at it. And that's what I want to focus on.
Andrew?
Well, we're close to closing our fund 3. And with that, we're going to be deploying bigger tickets into European pre-seed companies. So we're putting $1 to $2 million into UK and European companies. Also, we'll still invest on the West Coast, but our goal of doing that is to drag the size of the funding rounds up to match some of the competitors we see on the West Coast. Because, if you're a founder, you're starting particularly a deep tech company, but any startup, and you raise $1 million in Europe at pre-seed, but your competitors raised 4 or more on the West Coast, that's hell of a delta to close and compete against if when we're trying to back global winners. So we'll be investing alongside lots of great funds, hopefully like yourself, Super Seed, Outsize, and many others, and actually get those founders out of the door so that they can reach that next inflection point, rather than what we so often see in Europe, which is they don't raise enough money and then they get sliced and diced and our ownership gets diluted because they do a pre-seed round, then they do a seed round, then they do a seed extension, then they do a pre-series A, whatever the hell that is, round. Give the company enough money to get to that next inflection point where the market will back the company properly and when they've actually proven something. So that's our goal.
Let's go for it. Gentlemen, it's been a gift and a pleasure. I hope all of your 2025 dreams come true, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure was all ours. Thanks, Dan.
Fantastic. Have a good one.